This is my true story. 20 years ago, my 6-year-old son disappeared from our backyard while I was making lunch. No trace, no witnesses. Police searched for months, but found nothing. My wife left me. I lost everything and lived alone ever since with his missing poster on my wall until last Thursday when I was watching the news about a major embezzlement case and saw a face on TV. Then my life completely collapsed. Before that, tell us where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. And please subscribe to this channel so that my stories can reach more people. 20 years ago, I was 41 years old working as an accountant, living in a nice suburban house with my wife and 2 children. Noah was 6 years old. His younger sister Lily was 4. We had a good life, a normal life. The kind of life where you don't expect tragedy, where you think bad things only happen to other people, where you take your safety and your children for granted because nothing has taught you to do otherwise. It was a Saturday in June, a beautiful sunny day. My wife had gone to the grocery store. I was home with Noah and Lily. They wanted to play outside in the backyard. I said yes. It was a safe neighborhood. We had a fenced yard. I could see them from the kitchen window. I'd let them play outside dozens of times before. There was no reason to think this time would be different, no reason to expect what was about to happen. I was inside the house preparing lunch for the kids, making sandwiches and cutting up fruit. Simple tasks I'd done 1,000 times. The kitchen window looked out onto the backyard. I could see Noah and Lily playing. Noah was on the swing set. Lily was digging in her sandbox. They were happy, safe, right there where I could see them. I turned away from the window to put the sandwiches on plates. That's when everything changed. I heard the phone ring. This was back when we had landlines, before cell phones were common. The phone was on the wall in the kitchen. I answered it thinking it was my wife calling from the store. But it was a telemarketer, some company trying to sell me insurance or something. I should have just hung up. But I was polite back then. I tried to tell them I wasn't interested. The call lasted maybe 2 minutes. Maybe less. Just a quick conversation while I stood at the kitchen counter still preparing lunch. When I hung up, I called out to the kids that lunch was ready. I expected to hear them run toward the back door. But I only heard one set of footsteps. Lily came running inside. Her face was dirty from playing in the sandbox. She was smiling, ready to eat. But Noah wasn't with her. I asked where her brother was. She said she didn't know. She'd been playing in her sandbox. She hadn't been paying attention to what Noah was doing. I went to the back door and called Noah's name. No response. I stepped out into the backyard expecting to see him hiding somewhere. Maybe behind the shed or up in the treehouse. Kids hide sometimes. It's a game. I called his name again louder. Still no response. I started walking around the yard checking all his usual spots. Behind the shed, in the treehouse, under the deck. He wasn't anywhere. The gate was still latched. I checked it specifically. It was the kind of gate that latched from the inside. A child couldn't reach it without climbing. Noah was tall for his age, but not tall enough to reach that latch. The gate was secure. Nobody had gone through it. The fence was 6 feet high. Solid wood. No gaps. No way for a child to climb over it. The yard was completely enclosed. There was no way Noah could have left on his own. I started to panic. I ran through the house checking every room thinking maybe he'd come inside while I was on the phone and I hadn't noticed. Maybe he'd gone to his bedroom or the bathroom, but he wasn't inside. I checked closets, under beds, in the basement. Everywhere a child could hide. He was nowhere in the house. I went back outside and searched the yard again, looking more carefully this time. Checking behind every bush and tree, calling his name over and over. My wife came home from the grocery store around that time. She saw me running around the yard frantically calling Noah's name. She asked what was wrong. I told her I couldn't find Noah, that he'd been playing in the backyard and now he was gone. She dropped her grocery bags and started searching with me. We tore through the yard, through the house, through the garage, calling his name, getting more desperate with each passing minute. After 15 minutes of searching, we called the police. We were both in full panic mode by then. The operator asked how long Noah had been missing. I said maybe 20 minutes. She said officers would be there soon. She told us to keep searching, to check with neighbors, to look in any places he might have gone. We ran to the neighbors' houses, asked if they'd seen Noah, if he'd come to their doors. Nobody had seen him. Nobody had heard anything unusual. He'd just vanished. The police arrived within 10 minutes. They searched our property. They searched the neighbors' yards. They brought dogs. The dogs tracked Noah's scent to the back corner of our yard near the fence. Then the trail just stopped, like he'd vanished into thin air right there at that spot. There were no signs of struggle, no footprints besides Noah's small ones, no indication of how he'd gotten over or through that locked fence. He was just gone. Police interviewed everyone on our street. Nobody had seen anything. Nobody had heard any screams or sounds of struggle. No strange cars had been noticed in the neighborhood. No suspicious people. It was like Noah had simply ceased to exist. One moment he was playing on his swing set. The next moment, he was gone. And nobody saw or heard anything that explained how or why. The search for Noah consumed the next several months. Police brought in FBI agents who specialized in child abductions. They conducted interviews with everyone who'd ever been near our family. Teachers from Noah's school, parents of his friends, our relatives, our co-workers. They investigated every possible lead, no matter how unlikely. They checked registered sex offenders in the area. They looked at custody disputes, even though my wife and I were happily married. They considered every scenario. Volunteers organized massive search parties. Hundreds of people from our community came out to help. They searched the woods behind our neighborhood. They searched abandoned buildings. They checked storm drains. They walked through fields and parks. They knocked on doors asking if anyone had seen Noah or knew anything about his disappearance. The community support was incredible, but it led nowhere. Every search came up empty. Every lead turned into a dead end. We made missing person posters with Noah's picture. His sweet 6-year-old face smiling at the camera. The photo had been taken just 2 months before he disappeared. He was wearing his favorite blue shirt. His hair was messy like always. He looked happy and innocent. We plastered those posters everywhere. Every telephone pole, every store window, every community bulletin board. His face was everywhere in our town, then in surrounding towns, eventually in 3 states. The media covered Noah's disappearance extensively for the first few weeks. Local news stations ran stories about him. National networks picked it up. Our faces were on television begging anyone with information to come forward. My wife and I did interview after interview, pleading for someone to tell us where our son was, offering rewards for information. The attention was intense and exhausting, but we hoped it would help bring Noah home. After about 6 months, the media attention died down. The news moved on to other stories. The search parties became smaller and less frequent. The police still investigated, but they had fewer leads to follow. Life started returning to normal for everyone except us. For my wife and me, life had stopped the moment Noah disappeared. We couldn't move forward. We couldn't accept that he was gone. We stayed frozen in that horrible day. My marriage didn't survive the grief. My wife blamed me for what happened. She said I should have been watching more carefully. I shouldn't have answered that phone call. I should have kept both kids in my sight at all times. She was right. I blamed myself more than she ever could. But hearing her say it out loud made it worse, made the guilt unbearable. We started fighting. Small arguments turned into screaming matches. The pain and anger had to go somewhere, and we took it out on each other. My wife eventually said she couldn't look at me anymore, that seeing my face reminded her of losing Noah. She said she needed to leave for her own mental health. She took Lily and moved to another state to live with her sister. She filed for divorce. The papers came in the mail 6 months after Noah disappeared. I signed them without fighting. What was the point? Our family was already destroyed. The divorce just made it official. After my wife left, I fell apart completely. I couldn't focus on work. I'd sit at my desk staring at my computer, unable to concentrate on the numbers in front of me. I'd take long lunch breaks and just drive around looking for Noah, checking parks and playgrounds, looking at every child hoping one of them would be my son. My boss was patient at first, but after a few months of poor performance, he had to let me go. I understood. I wasn't doing my job. I wasn't capable of functioning normally. I lost my house because I couldn't keep up with the mortgage payments without a steady income. I had to sell it at a loss just to avoid foreclosure. Leaving that house was one of the hardest things I've ever done. Because Noah had lived there. Because it was the last place he'd been safe. Because leaving felt like abandoning him. Like if he ever found his way home, he wouldn't know where to go. But I had no choice. I couldn't afford to stay. I moved into a cheap studio apartment in a different part of town. Just one room with a kitchenette and a bathroom. It was depressing and lonely, but it was all I could afford. I took whatever work I could find. Eventually I got a job as a night janitor at an office building. It paid minimum wage, but it was steady. I worked nights because I couldn't sleep anyway. Might as well be doing something productive with those dark, empty hours. The years passed slowly, each one more hopeless than the last. I attended support groups for parents of missing children. Everyone there had the same hollow look in their eyes, the same desperate hope mixed with crushing despair. We'd share our stories, support each other. But nothing really helped. Nothing could fill the void left by a missing child. I kept Noah's missing person poster taped to my apartment wall. It was the only decoration I had. Every morning I'd wake up and see his face. Every night before bed I'd look at it, hoping somehow he'd find his way back. Hoping for a miracle that never came. The poster became faded over time. The tape yellowed. But I never took it down. It was my connection to him. Police eventually told me gently that I should prepare for the worst, that after 2 years with no leads and no sightings, Noah was most likely dead. They didn't say it directly, but the implication was clear. They'd moved on. They'd filed Noah's case away with all the other cold cases that would never be solved. They suggested I hold a memorial service, get closure, try to move on with my life. But how do you move on without a body, without knowing what happened, without closure? I'm 61 years old now. 20 years have passed since that June day. I still work as a night janitor. I still live in that same studio apartment. I never remarried, never dated, never tried to build a new life. I've just existed, going through the motions of living while feeling dead inside. I'd made peace with the fact I'd probably die without knowing what happened to Noah. That I'd spend the rest of my life wondering if he was out there somewhere, or if he'd died shortly after being taken. The not knowing was its own special torture. But I'd learned to live with it because I had no choice. Last Thursday evening I came home from my janitorial shift around midnight like I always did. I was exhausted from spending 8 hours cleaning office buildings. My body ached, my feet hurt. All I wanted to do was eat something quick and go to bed. I had a frozen dinner in my small freezer, one of those cheap microwavable meals that cost $2. I popped it in the microwave and waited for it to heat up. While the microwave was running, I turned on my television. I kept it on mostly for background noise. The apartment was too quiet otherwise, too empty. The silence reminded me how alone I was. So I'd have the TV on even if I wasn't really watching it, just to have some sound, some voices, some reminder that the world was still out there, even if I wasn't really part of it anymore. The local news was on. I wasn't paying much attention, just half listening while I got my dinner out of the microwave and sat down at my small table. The news anchor was talking about various stories, traffic accidents, city council meetings, weather forecasts, the usual stuff that I barely registered. I started eating my dinner, still not really watching the screen, just going through the motions of another lonely evening. Then the news anchor said something that caught my attention. She was introducing a story about a major financial crime. A local financial advisor had been arrested for embezzling millions of dollars from his clients, specifically targeting elderly people. The story was getting coverage because of how much money was stolen and how many victims there were. The anchor said it was one of the largest embezzlement cases in the state's history. They cut to footage of the arrest. Police leading a man out of an office building in handcuffs. The man's face was clearly visible. He wasn't trying to hide, wasn't ducking away from cameras. He was walking with his head up, almost defiant. The camera got a good clear shot of his face. And that's when my fork fell from my hand, clattered onto my plate, food scattered across my table. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't process what I was seeing. The face on the screen was my son's face, Noah's face. 20 years older, but unmistakably him. The same features I'd memorized from 6 years of being his father. The same features I'd stared at in that missing person poster every single day for 20 years. The same face I'd imagined aging as I wondered what he'd look like as a teenager, as a young man, as an adult. And here he was, on my television screen, being arrested. The news showed his mugshot next, a formal police photograph with his name and age displayed below. Nathan Pierce, 26 years old. That was the name they used, not Noah Chen, not my son's real name, but Nathan Pierce, a stranger's name attached to my son's face. The age was right. Noah would be 26 now. 20 years had passed since he disappeared at 6 years old. The math worked perfectly. This had to be him. I stared at the screen trying to understand what I was seeing, trying to make sense of it. My son was alive. After 20 years of not knowing, after assuming he was probably dead, after accepting I'd never see him again, here he was, alive, 26 years old, on the news. But not as a victim who'd been found, not as a missing person who'd come home. He was there as a criminal, as someone who'd committed terrible crimes. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The news anchor continued talking, explaining the charges against Nathan Pierce: wire fraud, elder abuse, theft. He'd allegedly stolen $3.2 million from elderly clients over a 5-year period. He'd worked as a financial advisor, gained the trust of vulnerable people, then systematically drained their accounts while they believed he was helping them invest their retirement savings. 23 victims had been identified so far, most of them now financially ruined. Some had lost their entire life savings. They showed photos of some of the victims, elderly men and women in their 70s and 80s, people who looked kind and trusting, people who reminded me of the volunteers who'd searched for Noah 20 years ago. Elderly community members who'd given their time and energy trying to find my missing son. And now my son had grown up to prey on people just like them, to steal from them, to destroy their financial security in their final years. The irony was crushing. The news report continued with more details. Nathan Pierce had been arrested at his office. Police had been building the case against him for months. They'd finally gathered enough evidence to make the arrest. He was being held on $5 million bail. He was facing decades in federal prison if convicted. The victims were seeking restitution, but most of the money was gone, spent or hidden. They'd probably never recover what they lost. I sat frozen in my chair, staring at the television long after the story ended. The news had moved on to other topics: sports scores, entertainment news. But I couldn't process any of it. My mind was stuck on that face, on Noah's face, on the impossible reality that my missing son was alive and was a criminal who'd hurt innocent people, people like the ones who'd tried to help find him. I grabbed my remote and rewound the DVR. I'd recorded the news without really thinking about it, just a habit. I went back to the beginning of the story about Nathan Pierce. I paused on the frame showing his face most clearly. Then I got up and went to my wall where Noah's missing person poster still hung. The poster had an age progression image the police had created years ago, a computer-generated picture of what Noah might look like at various ages, including 26. I held up my phone and took a picture of the age progression. Then I compared it to the paused image on my TV screen. The similarities were striking: the shape of the face, the spacing of the eyes, the distinctive features. Noah had a cleft chin even as a child. Nathan Pierce had the same cleft chin. Noah had unusual gray-blue eyes. So did Nathan Pierce. Noah had a small scar above his left eyebrow from falling off his bike when he was 4. Nathan Pierce had a faint scar in the same exact spot. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't just someone who looked similar. This was my son, 20 years older, living under a different name, committing crimes that made me sick to think about, but alive, unmistakably alive. And that realization broke something inside me that had been holding together through 20 years of grief and uncertainty. I spent the next several hours rewinding and pausing that news footage, studying every frame where Nathan Pierce's face was visible, taking screenshots on my phone, zooming in on details, comparing them to photos I had of Noah from when he was a child. I had boxes of Noah's things stored in my closet, photos and videos and medical records, Everything I'd kept for 20 years. Everything I'd saved in case I ever needed to identify him if he was found. I pulled out the boxes and spread everything across my floor. Photos of Noah at every age, from birth to 6 years old. I studied his features carefully. The shape of his nose, the curve of his jaw, the way his ears sat on his head, all the small details that make a face unique. Then I compared them to the screenshots of Nathan Pierce, looking for similarities. Looking for proof that this wasn't just my desperate mind seeing what it wanted to see. The cleft chin was the first thing I focused on. Noah had a very distinctive cleft chin even as a baby. It was a genetic trait he'd inherited from my father. My father had the same cleft. I had a less pronounced version, but Noah's was deep and obvious. In every photo of him you could see it. And Nathan Pierce had the exact same cleft chin, same depth, same shape, same positioning. It wasn't just similar, it was identical. The eyes were next. Noah had unusual eyes that people always commented on. They were gray-blue, not quite gray and not quite blue. Kind of in between. They changed color slightly depending on the lighting. In bright sunlight they looked more blue. In indoor lighting they looked more gray. I'd never seen anyone else with that exact eye color. But Nathan Pierce had it. In the arrest footage and the mugshot, you could see his eyes clearly. That same distinctive gray-blue color. The scar was the most convincing detail. When Noah was 4 years old, he'd fallen off his bike in our driveway. He'd scraped his forehead on the pavement. The wound had required 3 stitches. It healed into a small scar above his left eyebrow. About an inch long, slightly lighter than the surrounding skin. You could see it clearly in photos taken after the accident. And Nathan Pierce had a scar in the exact same location. Same size, same shape, same position above the left eyebrow. I found Noah's medical records in the boxes. His pediatrician had documented everything. Height and weight at every checkup. Vaccinations, illnesses, injuries. I read through the notes from when he got the stitches for that bike accident. The doctor had noted the location as 2 centimeters above the left eyebrow. I looked at the screenshot of Nathan Pierce, measured the scar with my fingers on the screen. It was in the exact same spot the medical records described. I had dental records too. Police had told me to keep them in case Noah's body was ever found. Dental records are one of the most reliable ways to identify remains. Noah had some dental work done when he was 5, a filling in one of his baby teeth. An orthodontist had also noted that Noah would probably need braces when he got older because his teeth were slightly crowded. The records were detailed. They'd be useful for comparison if I could get access to Nathan Pierce's dental records. Police had created age progression images when Noah had been missing for about 5 years. Computer programs that predict how a child's face will age based on their features and family genetics. They'd made images showing what Noah might look like at ages 10, 15, 20, and 25. I pulled out the image showing him at 25. It was remarkably close to 26, close enough to be useful for comparison. I held the age progression image next to my phone showing Nathan Pierce's mugshot. The similarities were striking. The computer program had predicted Noah would have a strong jawline. Nathan Pierce had a strong jawline. The program predicted Noah's face would be angular with high cheekbones. Nathan Pierce had an angular face with high cheekbones. The program showed Noah's nose would be straight and proportional to his face. Nathan Pierce's nose was straight and proportional. Obviously, age progression isn't perfect. Computers can't predict everything. They can't account for lifestyle factors or injuries or surgeries. But the general structure matched. The underlying bone structure that doesn't change with age was the same between the age progression and the real person. That underlying sameness was what you looked for when comparing images. And it was there. Undeniably there. I looked for differences too. Things that didn't match. Trying to talk myself out of what I was seeing. Trying to find proof this wasn't Noah. Nathan Pierce's hair was darker than I expected. Noah had been a light-haired child, blonde almost, but children's hair darkens as they age. That's normal. Nathan Pierce's face looked harder, more angular, less soft than the age progression predicted. But 20 years of unknown experiences would change someone's face, would add hardness, would age them in ways computers couldn't predict. Nathan Pierce also had tattoos visible on his arms in the arrest footage. Noah obviously hadn't had tattoos at age 6. But tattoos are choices people make as adults. They don't prove identity one way or another. He wore glasses in the mugshot. Noah hadn't needed glasses as a child. But vision changes with age. Lots of people develop the need for glasses as adults. Again, that proved nothing about identity. I kept coming back to the unchangeable features, the bone structure, the cleft chin, the eye color, the scar. These were things that don't change over time, things that can't be altered without major surgery. And all of them matched. Every single identifying feature Noah had as a child was visible in Nathan Pierce as an adult. The match wasn't just close, it was perfect. Too perfect to be coincidence. I spent the whole night doing this comparison, obsessively checking every detail. By the time the sun started coming up, I was exhausted but certain. Nathan Pierce was Noah Chen. My missing son was alive. He'd been living under a different name for 20 years. And now he was in jail, facing decades in prison for crimes that made me sick. My son wasn't dead. But the boy I'd known was gone, replaced by a stranger who hurt vulnerable people. I didn't know which reality was worse. Friday morning, I didn't sleep. I couldn't. I sat in my apartment surrounded by photos and documents, my mind racing with what I needed to do next. I needed to contact the police. I needed to tell them that Nathan Pierce might be my missing son. But I also felt terrified. What if I was wrong? What if this was just some cruel coincidence? What if my desperate hope was making me see connections that weren't really there? But I couldn't ignore what I'd seen. The similarities were too specific, too exact. I had to at least report it. Let the professionals determine if I was right or crazy. So around 8 in the morning, I called the police department handling Nathan Pierce's embezzlement case. I got transferred to the detective in charge. His name was Detective Morrison. He answered sounding busy and slightly annoyed at being bothered so early. I introduced myself, told him my name was Robert Chen. Then I said the words that sounded insane, even as they came out of my mouth. The man you arrested yesterday, Nathan Pierce. I think he's my son who was kidnapped 20 years ago. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could hear Detective Morrison breathing, probably trying to figure out if I was serious or if this was some kind of prank call. Finally he spoke. His voice was careful, professional but skeptical. He asked me to explain what I meant, so I told him the whole story, how my 6-year-old son Noah had disappeared from our backyard in 2004, how police had searched for months but found nothing, how I'd been living with his disappearance for 20 years, how I'd seen Nathan Pierce on the news and recognized him as my son, how the physical features matched too perfectly to be coincidence. Detective Morrison listened without interrupting. When I finished, he asked some questions. What was my son's full name? When exactly did he disappear? What city did we live in? What police department handled the original investigation? I answered everything, gave him all the details I'd been carrying in my head for 2 decades. He said he'd look into it, that he'd pull the old missing person case file, that he'd call me back. I gave him my phone number and waited. The hours passed slowly. I tried to distract myself but couldn't focus on anything. I kept checking my phone, kept playing the news footage again, kept second-guessing myself. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe this was just wishful thinking from a desperate father who'd never gotten closure. Maybe I was about to make a fool of myself and get my hopes crushed. Detective Morrison called back around 2 in the afternoon. He said he'd found Noah's missing person case in the national database. He'd reviewed the file, looked at the photos and descriptions. He said based on the physical features described in the case file, it was possible Nathan Pierce could be Noah Chen. But possible wasn't certain. They needed more than just visual similarities. They needed scientific proof. He asked if I could provide biological samples for DNA comparison. Something from Noah that would have his DNA. Hair from a brush. Baby teeth if I'd saved them. Anything that could be tested against Nathan Pierce's DNA. I told him yes, I had everything. I'd kept Noah's things for exactly this reason, in case his body was ever found and needed to be identified. I never thought I'd use them to prove a living person was my son. Detective Morrison said to bring everything to the police station. He'd coordinate with the forensics lab. They'd run DNA comparison tests. He warned me it would take several days to get results, maybe a week depending on how backed up the lab was. He also warned me not to get my hopes up, that visual similarities didn't guarantee a DNA match, that there was a good chance Nathan Pierce wasn't Noah no matter how much he looked like him. I told him I understood, but I had to know for sure. I had to find out if this was real or if I was chasing ghosts. He said he understood too, that he'd worked missing person cases before, that he knew how devastating it was for families who never got answers. He said he'd do everything he could to get me those answers as quickly as possible. I gathered everything I had that might contain Noah's DNA, his baby teeth that I'd kept in a small box. I'd saved them when they fell out like parents do, never imagining they'd be important for identification decades later. I found his old hairbrush that still had strands of his hair in it. I'd never used it for anything else, never cleaned it out. It had been sitting in a box untouched for 20 years. I also gathered his medical records, his dental records, every document that described Noah's physical features, birth certificates, vaccination records, the pediatrician's notes about that bike accident and the stitches, everything that could help establish identity beyond just DNA. I put it all in a bag and drove to the police station. Detective Morrison met me in the lobby. He looked tired, like he'd been working long hours on the embezzlement case. He led me to a conference room and asked me to lay out everything I'd brought. I spread it across the table, the baby teeth, the hairbrush, the medical records, the photos. He picked up each item carefully, looked at the photos, read through some of the medical notes. He said they'd send the biological samples to the lab today, priority processing because of the circumstances. He said DNA results typically took 3 to 5 days. He'd call me as soon as he had them. He asked if I had any other family who should be notified. I told him my ex-wife lived out of state. We hadn't spoken in 15 years. My daughter Lily was now 24. She barely remembered her brother. I was the only one who needed to know right now. Detective Morrison walked me out. He shook my hand, told me he hoped the results would give me answers one way or another, said he couldn't imagine living 20 years not knowing what happened to my child. I thanked him and left. Then I went home to wait. 3 agonizing days of waiting to find out if my son was alive or if I was chasing a cruel coincidence that would break my heart all over again. Those 3 days waiting for the DNA results were the longest 3 days of my life, worse than the first 3 days after Noah disappeared. Back then, I'd still had hope, still believed he'd be found quickly, that it was all some misunderstanding or mistake. But now, I was older, more cynical, more aware of how cruel the world could be. I knew this could go either way. Nathan Pierce could be my son, or he could be a stranger who just happened to look like him. And I didn't know which outcome would be worse. I couldn't work. I called in sick to my janitorial job, told them I had the flu. I just sat in my apartment staring at my phone, waiting for it to ring, checking it constantly to make sure I hadn't missed a call, playing out scenarios in my head. What I'd do if the DNA matched, what I'd do if it didn't, how I'd handle either answer. Neither felt manageable. Both felt like they'd destroy me in different ways. I thought about Nathan Pierce constantly, about the crimes he'd committed, about the elderly victims he'd stolen from. I'd seen their faces on the news, heard their stories. A 78-year-old woman who'd lost her entire retirement savings. An 82-year-old man who'd trusted Nathan to manage his late wife's life insurance payout. A 75-year-old couple who'd been planning to leave their savings to their grandchildren but now had nothing left. These were good people, vulnerable people, people who'd worked their whole lives and saved carefully for retirement. And Nathan Pierce had systematically destroyed their financial security. He'd befriended them, gained their trust, then stolen everything while they believed he was helping them. The cruelty of it was staggering. The calculated nature of it made me sick. And this might be my son. The little boy I'd raised to be kind and honest might have grown into a monster who preyed on the elderly. I tried to understand how that transformation could happen, How a 6-year-old child could become a 26-year-old criminal. What had Noah experienced in those 20 missing years? Who had raised him? What had they done to him? What trauma had he endured? Or was there something wrong with him that I'd never seen? Some darkness in him even as a child that I'd been too blind to recognize. The questions tormented me. Part of me hoped the DNA wouldn't match. Hoped Nathan Pierce was just a stranger. Because if he was Noah, then I'd have to face the reality that my son was a criminal. That the boy I'd loved had grown into someone I couldn't recognize. Someone who did terrible things. Someone I'd be ashamed of. If Nathan Pierce wasn't Noah, then at least I could keep my memories pure. Keep believing my son had been an innocent victim. Not a predator himself. But another part of me desperately wanted the DNA to match. Because that would mean Noah was alive. After 20 years of not knowing. After assuming he was probably dead. After accepting I'd never see him again. He'd be alive, even if he was in jail, even if he'd done horrible things. At least he'd be alive. At least I'd know what happened to him. At least I'd have answers instead of endless questions. At least I could see him again, even if he was a stranger to me. The call came on Monday afternoon, 3 days after I'd provided the samples. My phone rang and Detective Morrison's number appeared on the screen. My heart started pounding. My hands shook as I answered. I could barely get the word hello out. My voice cracked. Detective Morrison could probably hear how terrified I was, how much this answer mattered. He didn't make me wait, didn't draw it out. He just said it directly. Mr. Chen, the DNA results came back. It's a match, 99.99% certainty. Nathan Pierce is your son. Noah is alive. His voice was gentle. Like he knew those words would hit me like a bomb, like he understood this wasn't simple good news. This was complicated and painful and overwhelming. I couldn't speak, couldn't form words. I just sat there holding the phone, breathing hard, trying to process what I'd just been told. My son was alive. Noah was alive. After 20 years. After 2 decades of grief and uncertainty and hopelessness. He was alive. That should have been the best news of my life. The answer to 20 years of prayers. But it felt more like a nightmare than a miracle. Detective Morrison continued talking, said they'd informed Nathan Pierce of the DNA results, told him his real name was Noah Chen, that he'd been kidnapped as a child, that his biological father had been searching for him. Detective Morrison said Nathan's reaction had been complicated. He'd seemed shocked, confused, like he'd suspected his identity wasn't real but had never known the truth. The detective said Nathan had asked questions about me, about his disappearance, about what his life had been before he was taken. I asked Detective Morrison what happens next. He said I'd be allowed to visit Nathan in jail if I wanted, that Nathan would have to consent to the visit, that it would be supervised, that I shouldn't expect too much. Nathan had lived 20 years with a different identity. He didn't remember being Noah. He didn't remember me or his childhood or his family. Those memories were gone, replaced by 20 years of being someone else. Detective Morrison also explained that this complicated the embezzlement case. Nathan's lawyers would likely use his traumatic childhood as part of their defense strategy. Argue that being kidnapped and raised with a false identity had psychological effects that contributed to his criminal behavior. That he wasn't entirely responsible because of what had been done to him. The detective said it might reduce his sentence, or it might not. Depended on the judge and jury. I thanked Detective Morrison for calling, for handling this with sensitivity, for getting me answers after 20 years. He said he'd arrange for a visitation if I wanted, that I should call him when I was ready. I said I needed a few days to process this, to figure out what I wanted to do. He understood, said to take my time, that Noah wasn't going anywhere. He was in jail awaiting trial. I'd have plenty of opportunities to see him. I hung up and sat in silence. My son was alive. That fact kept repeating in my head. Noah was alive. But he wasn't Noah anymore. He was Nathan Pierce, a criminal who'd hurt innocent people, a stranger with my son's DNA, and I had no idea what to do with that information. Over the next few days, Detective Morrison shared what they'd learned about Nathan Pierce's background, about what had happened to Noah during those 20 missing years. The investigation into Nathan's true identity had opened up his entire past. Police had gone through his records, interviewed people who'd known him, pieced together a timeline of where he'd been and who had raised him. What they discovered was both relieving and horrifying. At least I finally had answers. But the answers made me sick. Noah had been kidnapped by a couple named David and Patricia Pierce. They'd lived 3 states away from us. They'd lost their own 6-year-old son to cancer about a year before Noah disappeared. The grief had destroyed them. Patricia especially had become mentally unstable. She couldn't accept that her son was gone. She'd started seeing him everywhere, becoming convinced that other children were actually her son, that somehow he'd survived and she just needed to find him. David had tried to get Patricia help, therapy, medication, but nothing worked. She remained convinced their son was alive somewhere. One day, she'd been in our area visiting her sister. She'd seen Noah playing in our backyard. Something about him had triggered her delusion. She'd become convinced he was her son, her dead son somehow alive. She'd waited until I went inside. Then she'd gone into our yard and taken Noah. Just walked in, picked him up, carried him out. The whole thing had taken less than a minute. Noah had apparently been confused, but not scared at first. Patricia had been gentle with him, told him she was taking him home to his daddy. Young children are trusting. They don't always know when danger is happening. By the time Noah realized something was wrong, they were already far away. David had been shocked when Patricia came home with a child. She'd told him this was their son, that she'd found him, that they could be a family again. David had known immediately this wasn't their son, but Patricia was so convinced, so happy for the first time in a year. David had to make a choice. Turn his wife in and lose her to prison and psychiatric care, or go along with the delusion. He'd chosen to protect her, to help her. They'd moved to a different state, changed their names slightly, created false identity documents for Noah, enrolled him in school as Nathan Pierce, raised him as their son. Noah had been confused and traumatized at first. He'd cried for me and his mother. He'd said his name was Noah, not Nathan. He'd talked about his real home and his little sister. But Patricia had a story ready. She'd told him that his memories were confused, that he'd been in an accident, that his real parents had died. She'd shown him fake death certificates she'd somehow created. She'd told him he was Nathan Pierce, and she was his mother who loved him. Young children are malleable. Their memories can be shaped by what adults tell them. After months of being told he was Nathan Pierce, after being shown fake documents, after being surrounded by a new life with new routines, Noah's memories of being Noah Chen had started to fade. By the time he was 7 or 8, he'd mostly accepted the story Patricia told him. He'd believed his name was Nathan, that the Pierces were his real parents, that his memories of another life were just confused dreams. David and Patricia had raised Noah as their son for the next 12 years. They'd loved him, genuinely loved him, as if he were their biological child. They'd sent him to school, celebrated his birthdays, helped with homework, did all the normal parenting things. Noah had grown up thinking they were his parents. He'd had a relatively normal childhood under the circumstances, not abused or neglected, just living a lie he didn't know was a lie. But when Noah was around 17 or 18, both David and Patricia had died within months of each other. David had a heart attack. Patricia had died from cancer shortly after. Noah had been devastated. He'd lost the only parents he remembered. He'd inherited their small estate, their house and savings. Not much, but enough for a young man starting out. He'd been going through their paperwork to settle the estate. That's when he'd found things that didn't make sense. He'd found his birth certificate, but it didn't match other documents. The seal looked fake. The information was inconsistent. He'd found photos of another child, a boy who looked similar to him but wasn't him. Photos labeled with a different name. He'd found letters from family members mentioning a son who'd died. But he was supposed to be that son. Nothing made sense. Everything about his identity started unraveling. Noah had hired a private investigator to look into his background. The investigator had discovered the identity documents were forgeries, that Nathan Pierce hadn't existed before age 6, that the birth certificate and social security number had been created fraudulently. The investigator couldn't find any record of Nathan Pierce being born. No hospital records, no nothing. It was like he'd appeared out of nowhere at age 6. The investigator had also found David and Patricia's real son's death certificate, proof that the original Nathan Pierce had died of cancer, that he'd been buried in a cemetery, that Noah was living under a dead child's identity. When confronted with this evidence, Noah's entire sense of self had shattered. Everything he'd believed about who he was had been a lie. His name was fake. His parents weren't his parents. His entire life was built on deception. Noah had tried to find out who he really was, but the trail went cold. The private investigator couldn't find any missing person reports that matched his description and age. Noah didn't have clear memories from before age 6. Just vague impressions that might be real memories or might be dreams. He'd known his whole life was a lie, but he had no way to discover the truth. No way to find his real identity. He'd been stuck in limbo. Not Nathan Pierce, but not knowing who he really was. That psychological break had apparently destroyed something fundamental in Noah. He'd become angry and bitter. Angry at the world that had stolen his identity. Bitter about being lied to his entire life. He'd developed a resentment toward authority and social systems. Felt like he'd been failed by everyone, and he'd channeled that anger into hurting others, specifically targeting vulnerable people who reminded him of the adults who'd failed to protect him as a child. Detective Morrison explained that Noah had spent his early 20s struggling with the identity crisis of not knowing who he really was. He'd finished high school, gone to community college, studied business and finance. He'd been smart, good with numbers, good at understanding how money worked. He'd gotten licensed as a financial advisor in his mid-20s, started working for a small investment firm. Everything had looked normal on the surface, but inside he'd been breaking apart. The bitterness about his stolen identity had been growing. Noah had told his therapist later that he'd felt like the world owed him something, that society had failed to protect him as a child, that adults had stolen his real life and replaced it with lies. He'd felt entitled to take from others what had been taken from him. It was twisted logic, damaged thinking from a traumatized mind, but it had driven him to commit terrible crimes. Noah had started small, taking a little extra from client accounts, charging slightly higher fees than he'd disclosed, just small amounts that clients wouldn't notice immediately, testing whether he could get away with it. And he could. The firm he worked for didn't have strong oversight. They trusted their advisors. They didn't audit every transaction. Noah had found a weakness and exploited it. Over time, the thefts had gotten bigger and more systematic. Noah had developed a specific strategy. He'd targeted elderly clients, people in their 70s and 80s, people who were vulnerable and trusting, people who didn't understand complex financial systems, people who needed help managing their retirement savings. These were the perfect victims for what Noah wanted to do. He'd befriend them first, spend time with them, visit their homes, bring them coffee, listen to their stories, become someone they trusted and relied on. Lonely elderly people often don't have many visitors, don't have many people who pay attention to them. Noah had given them attention, made them feel valued, made them think he genuinely cared about them. That friendship had been calculated, part of his scheme. Once he'd gained their complete trust, Noah would start stealing. He'd convince them to move their money into accounts he controlled. Tell them it was for better investment opportunities, better returns. They'd sign paperwork without reading it carefully because they trusted him, because he'd been so kind and attentive, because they thought of him as a friend or even a grandson figure. They'd hand over control of their life savings willingly. Then Noah would systematically drain their accounts, transfer money to offshore accounts he controlled, create fake investment statements showing their money was growing when really it was disappearing. The victims wouldn't realize what was happening for months or even years. By the time they figured out something was wrong, most of their money would be gone. Noah would have excuses ready. Market downturns, unexpected fees, bad investments, anything to buy more time. Detective Morrison said Noah had stolen from 23 elderly people over 5 years. The total was $3.2 million. Some victims had lost everything. Their entire retirement savings gone. Money they'd spent decades saving. Money they needed to pay for housing and medical care and basic living expenses. Noah had destroyed their financial security in their final years, left them with nothing. One victim was a 78-year-old woman named Margaret. She'd been a teacher for 40 years, saved carefully her whole career, had about $400,000 in retirement savings when she hired Noah to manage it. He'd stolen all of it over 3 years. Margaret had been planning to move into a nice assisted living facility. Instead, she'd had to move in with her daughter. Had to rely on her family because Noah had taken everything. She'd told police she'd trusted him completely, thought of him as family, never imagined he'd steal from her. Another victim was an 82-year-old widower named Frank. His wife had died and left him with about $300,000 in life insurance. Frank had hired Noah to invest it so he'd have income to live on. Noah had stolen it all within 2 years. Frank had been planning to leave that money to his grandchildren. Instead, he'd ended up with nothing. He'd told police he'd never trusted anyone like he'd trusted Nathan Pierce, that the betrayal had hurt worse than losing the money. There were 21 other victims with similar stories. Good people who'd worked hard and saved carefully. People who'd trusted Noah to help them. People who'd been systematically betrayed and robbed. When police finally arrested Noah, they'd been building the case for 6 months. They'd gathered evidence from bank records, from victim testimonies, from fake documents Noah had created. The evidence was overwhelming. What had struck Detective Morrison most was Noah's attitude when arrested. He'd shown no remorse, no guilt. When questioned about his victims, he'd said things like, "They represented the system that failed me," and "they had what I'd lost." He'd justified his crimes by claiming he was taking back what the world had stolen from him, as if random elderly people were responsible for his childhood trauma, as if their suffering somehow balanced his own. Noah had told police he'd specifically targeted elderly victims because they reminded him of the people who'd failed to protect him. The neighbors who hadn't noticed a child being abducted. The teachers who hadn't questioned his fake identity. The social systems that hadn't tracked him down. He'd wanted to make elderly people feel the loss and confusion he'd felt, wanted them to experience having everything taken away. It was cruel revenge directed at innocent people. The prosecutor had called Noah's crimes some of the most callous she'd seen, not just because of the money stolen, but because of the emotional manipulation involved. Noah had befriended these people, made them trust him, then destroyed them financially while maintaining the facade of caring. He'd watched them thank him for his help while he was robbing them. That level of deception and cruelty required someone deeply broken inside. Detective Morrison said he'd worked financial crime cases for 15 years. He'd seen embezzlement before. But Noah's case was different because of the psychological component. Most embezzlers stole out of greed or desperation. Noah had stolen out of rage, out of a twisted need to hurt others because he'd been hurt. His crimes weren't just about money, they were about inflicting pain, about making vulnerable people suffer the way he'd suffered. That made him particularly dangerous. A week after the DNA results came back, Detective Morrison called to say Noah had agreed to see me. I'd been debating whether I even wanted to visit him. Part of me desperately wanted to see my son after 20 years. Part of me was terrified of what I'd find. But I couldn't stay away. I needed to see him, even if he was a stranger, even if he'd done terrible things. He was still my son. So I agreed to the visit. The county jail was a depressing concrete building downtown. I'd never been to a jail before, never had any reason to visit one. The security process was intimidating. Metal detectors, pat-downs, surrendering my belongings, being led through locked doors that clanged shut behind me. Everything about the place felt cold and institutional. This was where my son was living, where he'd been for weeks while awaiting trial. A guard led me to a visitation room. It wasn't like what you see in movies with phones and glass partitions. It was a small room with a table and 2 chairs bolted to the floor. The walls were concrete block painted institutional beige. There was a camera in the corner recording everything. The guard told me to sit and wait, that the inmate would be brought in shortly. Then he left and locked the door behind him. I sat there alone for about 5 minutes. My heart was pounding. My hands were shaking. I didn't know what I was going to say. How do you talk to a son who doesn't remember you? How do you reconcile the 6-year-old you lost with the 26-year-old criminal sitting across from you? I had no idea. I just knew I needed to see him, needed to look at his face, needed to know this was real. The door opened, and a guard brought Noah in. He was wearing an orange jail jumpsuit. His hands were cuffed in front of him. His hair was shorter than in the news footage. His face was thinner. He looked tired. But he was unmistakably my son. 20 years older, but still recognizable. Still the boy I'd been searching for. Except he wasn't a boy anymore. He was a grown man. A stranger. The guard had Noah sit across from me, then uncuffed his hands and stepped back to stand by the door. Noah rubbed his wrists where the cuffs had been. Then he looked at me. Really looked at me. Studying my face the way I was studying his. Neither of us spoke at first. We just sat there looking at each other across that table. Two people connected by biology but separated by 20 years and trauma. Finally, I spoke. Noah. I said his real name. The name I'd given him. The name he'd lived with for his first 6 years. He flinched slightly when he heard it. Like the name was foreign to him. Which it was. He'd been Nathan Pierce for 20 years. Noah Chen didn't exist in his memory. I was a stranger using a name that meant nothing to him. I don't remember you. His voice was flat. Empty. No emotion. Just stating a fact. The police told me the DNA results. They said you're my biological father. They said I was kidnapped when I was 6. But I don't remember any of that. I don't remember being Noah. That person doesn't exist for me. His words were like knives. But I understood. 20 years was a long time. 6-year-old memories fade, especially when you're told those memories are lies. I tried to tell him about who he'd been. About the little boy who loved dinosaurs and hated broccoli, who could spend hours building with blocks, who gave the best hugs, who had the sweetest laugh. I pulled out photos I'd brought, pictures of him as a child, pictures of us together, me pushing him on a swing, him sitting on my shoulders, him blowing out candles on a birthday cake, evidence that he'd been my son, that we'd had a life together. Noah looked at the photos with no recognition. No spark of memory, just mild curiosity like he was looking at pictures of strangers. He pointed to one photo and asked who the little girl was. I told him that was his sister Lily, that she'd been 4 when he disappeared, that she'd been playing in the yard with him that day. He nodded but showed no emotional response. Lily was a stranger to him too. I asked him what he remembered about his childhood. He said he remembered being Nathan Pierce, living with David and Patricia, going to school, normal suburban childhood things. He said he had some vague impressions of things from before age 6, flashes of images that might be memories or might be dreams. A yellow house, a woman's voice singing, a smaller child, but nothing concrete, nothing he could identify as real memories versus imagination. He said when he found out his identity was fake, it had destroyed him. Learning that Nathan Pierce wasn't real. That everything he'd believed about himself was a lie. He'd tried to find out who he really was but had no information, no memories, no clues. He'd been stuck in limbo knowing he was someone else but not knowing who. The DNA results had finally given him answers, but the answers didn't change how he felt. I asked him about the crimes, about why he'd stolen from those elderly people. His face hardened. He said they represented the system that had failed him, that adults and authority figures had let him be kidnapped, had let him live a lie for 20 years. He'd wanted them to feel loss like he'd felt loss, wanted them to experience confusion and betrayal. It was revenge against a world that had stolen his identity. I told him those people weren't responsible for what happened to him, that they were innocent victims who'd done nothing wrong, that hurting them didn't fix what had been done to him. He just stared at me. Then he said, "You don't get to judge me. You're the one who let me get kidnapped. You're the one who didn't protect me. This is your fault as much as anyone's." Those words destroyed me. My son blamed me. He was right to blame me. I had failed to protect him. I'd gone inside for 2 minutes and he'd been taken. I'd spent 20 years living with that guilt. Hearing him say it out loud made it unbearable. I tried to explain, tried to tell him how hard we'd searched, how the police had investigated, how I'd never stopped looking. But he didn't want to hear it. Noah said he didn't want a relationship with me. That knowing his biological father didn't change anything. He was Nathan Pierce, not Noah Chen. The boy I'd lost was dead. He'd died somewhere in those 20 years of being someone else. The person sitting across from me was a stranger who happened to share my DNA. Nothing more. I visited Noah 2 more times after that first meeting. Each visit was the same. Cold. Distant. He'd answer my questions with short responses. He'd look at photos I brought with no recognition. He'd sit across from me like I was an interviewer or social worker. Not his father. Not someone who'd loved him and searched for him for 20 years. Just some old man who claimed to have a connection to him that he didn't feel. The 3rd time I visited, I asked if he remembered anything at all from being 6 years old. Any memory of me or his mother or his sister. Anything that might connect him to who he'd been. He said no. He said whatever memories he might have had were gone. Overwritten by 20 years of being Nathan Pierce. He said even if he could remember it wouldn't change anything. Noah Chen was a stranger to him. A person who'd existed briefly, then disappeared. He had no attachment to that identity. I asked if we could build a relationship going forward. Even if he didn't remember the past. Even if I was a stranger. We were still father and son biologically. We could get to know each other now. Start fresh. But he refused. He said he didn't want anything from me. Didn't need a father. Didn't want the complication of pretending we had a relationship. He told me not to visit anymore. To move on with my life and let him serve his time in peace. Noah's trial happened about 4 months after his arrest. His lawyers tried to use his traumatic childhood as a defense. Argued that being kidnapped and raised with a false identity had caused psychological damage. That his crimes were a result of trauma he'd endured. That he wasn't fully responsible for his actions because of what had been done to him as a child. The prosecutor pushed back hard. Said his childhood trauma didn't excuse systematically stealing from vulnerable elderly people. That plenty of trauma survivors don't become criminals. The jury convicted him on all counts: wire fraud, elder abuse, theft. The judge sentenced him to 18 years in federal prison. 18 years. He'd be 44 when he got out. The judge said while she sympathized with Noah's traumatic childhood, she couldn't ignore the suffering he'd caused his victims. 23 people had been financially destroyed. Some had lost everything. That level of harm required serious consequences. I attended the sentencing hearing. Sat in the back of the courtroom watching my son hear his fate. He showed no emotion when the judge announced 18 years. Just nodded slightly. Accepted it without protest. Several of his victims were there. They gave statements about how his crimes had affected them. An 80-year-old woman crying about losing her home. A 75-year-old man talking about his destroyed retirement plans. Listening to them talk about what Noah had done made me sick. After the sentencing, Noah was transported to federal prison. He refused to see me before he left. Refused my letters. Instructed his lawyer to tell me to stop trying to contact him. He wanted nothing to do with me. Didn't want my visits. Didn't want my attempts at reconciliation. He'd made his position clear. I was nothing to him. A biological connection that meant nothing. The father who'd failed to protect him. Someone he wanted to forget. I tried contacting my ex-wife to tell her we'd found Noah. That he was alive. But she didn't want to hear it. She'd moved on. Remarried. Had a new life. She said she'd grieved Noah 20 years ago and wasn't going to dig up that pain. She said knowing he was alive but not wanting contact was worse than believing he was dead. She told me not to call her again. So I didn't. Our daughter Lily felt similarly. She barely remembered Noah. Didn't want to get involved in this complicated situation. I was alone in caring about finding him. The elderly victims of Noah's crimes reached out to me a few times. Some wanted to understand how a child who'd been kidnapped grew into someone who'd hurt them. Some were angry and blamed me for not raising him right. I tried to explain I'd only had him for 6 years, that someone else had raised him. But they didn't care about nuance. Their lives had been destroyed. They needed someone to blame. I understood. I blamed myself too. I still work as a night janitor. Still live in my studio apartment. Noah's missing person poster is gone from my wall now, replaced with nothing. Just blank space where his photo used to be. I have photos of him as an adult now, mugshots and court photos, but I don't display them. They don't show the son I lost. They show a stranger who committed crimes I can't forgive. I lost my 6-year-old son 20 years ago. Last week I saw his face on television, arrested for stealing $3.2 million from elderly victims. DNA tests proved Nathan Pierce was Noah Chen. My missing son was alive, but finding him didn't bring him back. The boy I'd loved was gone, replaced by a bitter criminal who blamed me for not protecting him, who refused to see me, who wanted nothing to do with the father who'd searched for him for 2 decades. Some missing children come home changed. Mine came home as someone who'd hurt people who reminded me of the volunteers who'd searched for him, who'd stolen from elderly victims like the ones who'd helped plaster his missing poster around town. The irony was crushing. The people who'd tried to save him would have been his targets. Noah is alive in federal prison serving 18 years. But the boy I lost is still gone. He died somewhere in those 20 years of lies and trauma. What came back was a stranger who shares my DNA but not my life. A man who committed crimes I can't forgive against victims I can't ignore. I found my son and lost him all over again. Except this time I know where he is. And he's chosen to stay gone. My life collapsed not when Noah disappeared, but when I found him and realized the child I'd loved was dead anyway. Gone forever. Replaced by someone I don't recognize. Someone who doesn't want to know me. I'd spent 20 years hoping to find him. Now I spend every day wishing the truth had been different. Wishing he'd stayed lost. Because knowing he's alive but wanting nothing to do with me is worse than not knowing at all.